Tuma thought these pharaohs were following some primal instinct, but to where? Is Father's power drawing them? Is it drawing me? city's army must have been unstoppable. But Atuma never spoke of any enemies worse than themselves. the power the Father wielded, I've no doubt his people worshipped him as a god. The anomaly's been twisting this place apart for centuries. Maybe because this is so close to wherever the anomaly comes from. Will all of Enoch look like this? Tuma said the Father built a palace over his passage. Find his throne room. I can probably find the entrance. These are gardens. Maybe. Would have been nice to see this place in its prime. Doubt anyone here is interested in tending the flowers. Why didn't the Daughter's people ever return here after they called the anomaly? I never heard about this city in the stories of the Pax. Was it lost to history? Or were they terrified of it?
This has got to be the palace. Now to find the throne room.
This city feels like I'm stuck in a bad dream. Need to keep it together.
Maybe a good thing this empire collapsed. If they'd been here when we arrived, would they have destroyed us? This place is beautiful. It clearly wasn't just war they were interested in. I wonder if their culture survived an attack. Anyone who didn't follow the daughter out of this city died here. But what killed them and left this city standing? Another ice age. Toxic air like in the forest. Every empire falls, but what was in that passage that the father was so obsessed with that he was willing to let it fall? Looks like Father's throne room. Impressive. Is that supposed to be a Tuma? It's the same face, and those gems on her forehead, that means Atuma was the daughter. All the stories she told me, they were about her. She was here for all of it. Some kind of private chambers. This is in English. Who the hell else has been here? Not Monroy. His people never got out of the desert. These cars, 1,000 years old. How the fuck did Father write in a language from galaxies away that hadn't even been invented yet?
What? Someone's joining my game? Trying to join.
Here we go. This must be Father's secret passage. No one else has been past here in 1,000 years. obelisk somehow. It must be the Great Seal. Father must have written all this. Tuma said he was consumed by his visions. The past and future. Everything. My God. The size of this well. This must be the source of all of Father's madness. Maybe of everything that's driven this whole world mad. If Father was writing in English centuries ago, galaxies away from Earth, what else did he know? Holy shit, look at all these creatures. But they're not moving. Huh. Almost peaceful. Was the Father building a goddamn army in some kind of... Is this... For what? They're still not moving. If they were guarding something, they'd be waking up by now. Maybe I'm not the threat that we're meant for. Not that I'm complaining. I think I'll keep quiet all the same. This place. It must have been drawing them all here. Answering some call to join Father's army. How many of Enoch's creatures are being lured by this place? Called by Father? Shit. What if this is where all the big guys were on the move to? This place. It must have been drawing them all here. answering some call to join Father's army. There's no way out of here. Not until I catch whatever ghosts are leading me deeper. Whatever's pulling me under this city. It could be all the answers. To everything. That chamber. Is this where Father meditated? Did these fumes grant Father his visions and stir his madness? Everyone's warned me. Janna said it would consume me. Atuma said there'd be no way back. And yet, I know what I have to do. Every fiber of my being is telling me to go back. But I can't. I need to know what happened down here. Before it happens. happens again. Galaxies, star systems, planets. This one, it almost looks like Earth. That's the Flores. And the Caravel? Oh, the father saw Monroy's arrival. He knew the Caravel would reach Enoch one day. The Outrider's insignia. You knew we were coming. You built a goddamn army to save your people from... us. Just 1,000 years too early. All those words he wrote in English, maybe they were for me. He knew I would come to this place. Maybe even wanted me to come here. Now, I need to know why.